The most dangerous thing about loyalty is that eventually people start believing they are entitled to it. Snow drifted slowly above downtown Chicago while cigar smoke curled through the private rooftop lounge of the Belarus Hotel 30 floors above the city. Warm jazz floated beneath low amber lighting. Men in tailored coats and expensive watches laughed quietly around polished black tables while whiskey glasses reflected gold against the skyline outside. The room carried the heavy silence of power disguised as luxury. Damien DeLuca sat near the windows in a charcoal suit with one arm resting lazily across the leather booth beside him. Calm, untouchable, the kind of man who never raised his voice because nobody around him ever required a second warning. Chicago knew his name long before he entered rooms. Across the table, one of his associates smirked while pouring another glass of bourbon. "You really think she is serious this time?" Damien exhaled cigar smoke slowly toward the ceiling before giving the faintest smile. "Clara." He leaned back comfortably. "She will cry for a night and come back tomorrow." The men around the table laughed quietly. Not cruelly, confidently, like men repeating something they already believed to be true. Outside the partially open glass doors leading toward the rooftop terrace, Clara stood frozen beneath the cold winter air. Black wool coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Snowflakes melting softly into her dark hair. She had arrived 15 minutes earlier after another dinner Damien forgot to attend. Another evening spent waiting alone inside the mansion overlooking Lake Michigan while his staff quietly removed untouched food from a table designed for two people who almost never sat together anymore. Clara heard every word through the cracked doorway. She did not interrupt, did not cry. Somehow that hurt more than the sentence itself. Inside the lounge, Damien continued discussing business as if nothing important had happened. Because to him, maybe nothing had. Clara always stayed. Through endless late nights. Through canceled vacations. Through dinners that turned cold while she waited beside enormous windows overlooking snow-covered streets. Through mornings waking up alone in silk sheets beneath ceilings too large for one person. She had forgiven so many absences that eventually Damien stopped seeing them as wounds at all. They simply became part of the life surrounding him. Power first. Business first. Emergencies first. Clara somewhere afterward waiting patiently in the spaces left behind. Clara stepped farther onto the rooftop terrace while freezing wind swept across the Chicago skyline around her. Below, headlights stretched through the city like rivers of light moving beneath snow and steel. The rooftop felt strangely quiet compared to the warmth inside the lounge behind her. For a moment, she stared down at her wedding ring beneath the pale rooftop lights. White gold, emerald-cut diamond. Damien chose it himself in Milan nearly 8 years earlier after promising her she would never feel alone beside him. Clara closed her fingers slowly around the ring until the edges pressed softly into her palm. Behind the glass, Damien laughed again at something one of the men said. The sound drifted toward her faintly beneath the jazz music. Once upon a time, hearing his voice made her feel safe. Tonight, it only made her tired. Tired of defending him to herself. Tired of waiting for him to come home before falling asleep. Tired of pretending loneliness looked glamorous simply because it lived inside a mansion instead of a small apartment. The terrace door opened quietly behind her. Damien stepped outside, adjusting the collar of his coat against the cold. "There you are," he said casually. "I wondered where you disappeared to." Clara turned toward him slowly. Snow moved between them beneath the rooftop lights. Damien approached with relaxed confidence, completely unaware that she had heard everything inside. He reached for her hand automatically, but Clara kept both hands inside her coat pockets. The movement was small, barely noticeable, yet Damien paused slightly. "You all right?" he asked. Clara looked past him toward the glowing city skyline beyond the terrace glass. "Do you ever get tired of assuming I will always stay?" The question caught him off guard enough to make him laugh softly beneath his breath. "Clara." His tone carried gentle amusement instead of concern. "You are upset. Tomorrow this will pass like it always does." "Like it always does." Clara stared at him for a long moment while snow collected quietly along the rooftop railing around them. The terrifying part was not that Damien underestimated her pain. It was that somewhere deep down, he genuinely believed she would never leave him no matter how invisible she felt standing beside his life. Clara finally nodded once. Calmly. "Maybe," she whispered softly. Damien relaxed immediately, mistaking her silence for surrender the way he always had. Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead before returning toward the warmth and power waiting inside the lounge behind him. Clara remained alone on the rooftop long after the door closed. Snow continued falling across Chicago while the city lights blurred softly beneath winter clouds. And standing there in the freezing silence with her wedding ring hidden inside her closed hand, Clara felt something inside her finally stop waiting. There comes a moment when a woman stops begging to be loved correctly and quietly begins preparing to survive without it instead. The DeLuca mansion stood silent beside the frozen shoreline of Lake Michigan while snow covered the long stone driveway outside in soft white layers. From a distance, the estate looked untouchable, warm lights glowing through tall windows. Black luxury cars lined perfectly near the entrance. Security guards moving quietly beneath falling snow. Everything about the property whispered power. But inside the mansion, silence stretched through the enormous hallways like something cold and permanent. Clara sat alone at the dining table beneath a crystal chandelier, while untouched pasta cooled slowly on fine porcelain plates across from her. Candles flickered softly between them. One chair occupied, one chair empty. Again, somewhere deeper inside the mansion, a grandfather clock echoed through the quiet. 11:47 at night. Damien had promised he would be home by 8. Clara stared at the second glass of wine beside his untouched plate while her fingertips rested lightly against the edge of the tablecloth. Years ago, she used to wait with excitement whenever Damien called saying he was almost home. Then disappointment became routine. Eventually routine became loneliness. The worst part was how normal it all started to feel. Her phone vibrated softly against the table. A message from Damien finally appeared across the screen. Running late. Do not wait up. No apology. No explanation. Just another absence packaged into 2 careless sentences. Clara closed her eyes briefly before locking the screen again. Across the room, the grand piano near the windows sat untouched beneath low amber lighting. Dust had started collecting faintly along the keys. Damien bought the piano for her during their second year of marriage after hearing her play once at a hotel lounge in New Orleans. Back then, he listened to her music. Back then, he still noticed the things that made her feel alive. Clara stood slowly from the table and walked toward the enormous windows overlooking the frozen lake outside. Snow drifted across the dark shoreline, while distant Chicago lights shimmered beneath the clouds. The mansion behind her remained perfectly quiet except for staff footsteps moving somewhere far away beyond closed doors. Luxury had a strange way of hiding loneliness beneath beautiful surfaces. The front doors finally opened downstairs nearly an hour later. Clara heard Damien's low voice echo faintly through the marble entrance hall while security quietly dispersed toward the garage outside. She did not move from the windows. A few minutes later, Damien entered the dining room, loosening the collar of his black coat while checking messages on his phone. "You are still awake," he said casually, surprised more than guilty. Clara looked toward the untouched dinner table. "I waited." Damien glanced at the cold food and sighed softly beneath his breath. "Clara, I told you not to." He spoke gently, calmly, like a man explaining something obvious to someone overly emotional. Clara stared at him for a moment before asking quietly, "Do you know how many dinners we have actually finished together this month?" Damien removed his watch slowly, distracted already by another message lighting up his phone screen. "I do not know." 3, Clara whispered. Damien finally looked up then. "You know how complicated things have been lately." There it was again. Business. Problems. Responsibility. The invisible wall separating his world from hers. Clara nodded faintly because she already knew the speech by heart. Damien crossed the room and kissed her forehead automatically before loosening his tie beside the dining table. "I am doing this for us," he said softly. Clara almost laughed at the sadness of that sentence. Because somewhere over the years, Damien stopped realizing there was no us left inside the life he built anymore. Only his world, his power, his schedule, and Clara waiting quietly inside the empty spaces around it. "Do you ever notice when I stop talking?" she asked suddenly. Damien frowned slightly, caught off guard. "What?" Clara looked toward the frozen lake beyond the windows again. "I used to tell you everything." Damien stepped closer, confused by the tension in her voice. "Clara," but she shook her head softly before he could continue. "Not angry. just exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. Upstairs, the mansion remained glowing and beautiful beneath chandelier light, while snow continued falling beyond the glass. Yet standing there in the middle of all that luxury, Clara realized something terrifying with complete clarity. She had spent years living inside a home where the person she loved most no longer truly noticed whether she felt lonely at all. The saddest part about emotional exhaustion is that eventually even heartbreak becomes too tiring to feel anymore. 3 nights later, freezing rain covered the streets of Chicago while wind rattled softly against the tall windows of the DeLuca mansion overlooking the lake. Inside the house, warm golden lights glowed across marble floors and endless hallways lined with expensive artwork chosen more by interior designers than by anyone actually living there. The mansion looked beautiful in photographs. Elegant, powerful, untouchable. But Clara had started noticing how quiet it became after midnight. Quiet enough to hear her own loneliness moving through the rooms beside her. She sat alone near the grand piano wearing one of Damien's oversized black sweaters while untouched tea cooled beside her on the polished wood table nearby. The clock on the wall read 1:14 in the morning. Damien still was not home. Again, Clara rested her fingers lightly against the piano keys without pressing them down. Years ago, she used to play while waiting for him. Soft jazz melodies drifting through the mansion after midnight, while snow covered the shoreline outside. Damien once told her the sound made the house feel alive. Then business expanded. Nights became longer. Security increased. More meetings. More emergencies. Eventually, Clara stopped playing because nobody stayed long enough to listen anymore. Headlights suddenly appeared beyond the gates outside. Black SUVs rolled slowly through the snowfall toward the mansion entrance, while guards moved quickly beneath the rain. Clara did not stand, did not rush toward the doorway like she used to years earlier. She simply remained beside the piano staring at the reflections moving across the windows. Damien entered the mansion several minutes later, removing his gloves while speaking quietly into his phone. His deep voice echoed faintly through the hallway before the call finally ended. He walked into the living room and paused immediately after seeing Clara awake. "You should be sleeping," he said softly. Clara looked toward the clock on the wall. "I could say the same thing to you." Damien loosened the collar of his dark coat and sighed tiredly beneath his breath. Tonight he looked exhausted in ways expensive suits and authority could not fully hide. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, tension in the way he rolled his shoulders. Clara noticed all of it because despite everything, she still paid attention to him. That was the problem. She always did. Damien crossed the room and poured himself whiskey near the fireplace while rain tapped steadily against the windows behind them. "There was an issue downtown," he explained. "I had to handle it personally." Clara nodded once. She no longer asked questions about his world because answers rarely changed anything. Damien glanced toward her carefully. "You have barely spoken to me all week." Clara lowered her eyes toward the piano keys beneath her fingertips. "I think I just ran out of things to say." The honesty in her voice unsettled him more than anger would have. Damien walked closer slowly, studying her expression beneath the dim lighting. "You are still upset about the rooftop?" Clara almost smiled sadly at that. He truly thought this started with one sentence. One joke. He still did not understand that loneliness had been building quietly between them for years. "It is not about that night," she whispered. Damien frowned. "Then what is it about?" Clara looked around the mansion slowly. The massive staircase, the silent chandeliers, the endless expensive emptiness surrounding them both. "Do you know what this house feels like after midnight?" she asked softly. Damien glanced around with confusion. "It is a house." Clara shook her head faintly. "No, it feels like waiting." The room fell silent except for the rain beyond the glass. Damien stared at her as though trying to understand a language he had never needed to speak before. Clara stood slowly from the piano bench and walked toward the windows overlooking the frozen shoreline outside. "I waited through every late dinner," she continued quietly. "Every canceled trip. Every night you promised things would slow down eventually." Damien's jaw tightened slightly. "I was building something for us." Clara turned toward him then, and for the first time there were no tears left in her eyes at all. That frightened him more than crying ever could. "That is the problem, Damien," she said softly. "You kept building a future while completely disappearing from the present." The sentence settled heavily into the silence between them. Damien looked away briefly toward the fireplace as though searching for the right response somewhere inside the room. But nothing came, because deep down, he knew she was right. Clara watched him quietly for another moment before slipping the wedding ring from her finger beneath the warm piano light. Not dramatically, not angrily, just gently, like someone finally putting down something too heavy to carry anymore. Damien's eyes dropped instantly toward the ring resting in her open palm. The entire room seemed to stop breathing around them. And standing there beside the piano while rain covered the windows overlooking Chicago, Clara realized something strange with terrifying calm. She was no longer afraid of losing him. She was afraid of losing herself completely if she stayed. Freedom felt strangely quiet the morning Clara left the mansion behind. Snow still covered Chicago when she woke before sunrise inside the enormous bedroom overlooking Lake Michigan. Pale winter lights spilled softly through sheer curtains while the rest of the estate remained silent beneath sleeping shadows and distant security patrols outside. For a long moment, Clara simply sat at the edge of the bed listening to the quiet around her. 8 years earlier, waking beside Damien felt exciting because every day seemed unpredictable beside a man powerful enough to bend entire rooms around his presence. Now the silence only felt heavy, empty, like a life paused for too long. Damien had not come home the night before. Another emergency downtown. Another message sent after midnight promising to explain later. Clara did not answer. The untouched wedding ring still rested beside the piano downstairs where she left it beneath the chandelier light hours earlier. She never imagined leaving dramatically. No screaming, no revenge, no shattered glasses or desperate speeches. The truth was sadder than that. Clara simply became too emotionally exhausted to keep waiting for love that always arrived after everything else. By 7:30 in the morning, she stood alone in the mansion kitchen wearing a cream sweater beneath a black wool coat, while one suitcase rested quietly beside the marble island. Snow drifted outside the tall windows overlooking the frozen shoreline. One of the house staff entered cautiously before freezing in surprise after seeing the luggage. "Mrs. DeLuca?" Clara gave a faint, polite smile. "Could you ask the driver to bring the car around?" The woman hesitated carefully. "Should I inform Mr. DeLuca?" Clara looked down briefly before answering softly, "No." 20 minutes later, black gates opened slowly behind the car, while the DeLuca mansion disappeared into the snowfall behind her. Clara watched the estate fade through the rear window without crying. That frightened her most of all. She had imagined leaving would feel devastating. Instead, it felt numb, like walking away from something emotionally abandoned long before today. Downtown Chicago slowly awakened beneath gray winter skies, while the car crossed bridges lined with icy river water and glowing traffic lights reflected across wet streets. Clara eventually asked the driver to stop near a quiet brick building beside the Chicago River. No guards, no gated entrance, no marble staircase, just a modest apartment tucked above a small florist and coffee shop. The apartment smelled faintly like fresh paint and old hardwood floors when Clara stepped inside, carrying her suitcase. Sunlight spilled through narrow windows overlooking snow-covered sidewalks below. Tiny kitchen, small couch, one bookshelf, silence that belonged entirely to her. Clara stood in the middle of the room for several seconds, simply breathing. No security radios echoing through hallways. No endless waiting for headlights outside the mansion gates. No pressure to remain perfectly composed while Damien disappeared deeper into a life where she always came second to power. Just quiet. Real quiet. The kind she had forgotten existed. Hours later, Damien finally returned to the mansion exhausted from another sleepless night downtown. He loosened his tie while walking through the entrance hall before stopping suddenly after noticing the unusual stillness inside the house. No piano music. No coffee brewing in the kitchen. No Clara sitting near the windows wrapped in one of his sweaters waiting for him to finally come home. A house employee approached carefully. "Sir." Damien looked toward her immediately. "Where is Clara?" The woman hesitated. "Mrs. DeLuca left this morning." Damien frowned slightly, more confused than alarmed. "Left where?" She did not say. He stared at the woman for one brief second before exhaling softly beneath his breath. Annoyance flickered across his face instead of fear. Because deep down, Damien still believed this would pass. Clara always needed time after arguments. Space. Distance. Then eventually she returned home. She always returned home. Damien walked farther into the mansion while removing his coat until his eyes landed on the wedding ring resting beside the piano beneath the chandelier light. The room suddenly felt colder. He picked up the ring slowly between his fingers while silence stretched heavily around him. For the first time since Clara walked out, something uncomfortable moved through his chest. Not panic yet. Something quieter. Uncertainty. Damien looked toward the frozen lake beyond the windows while snow continued falling softly across Chicago. Then after a long silence, he slipped the ring into his pocket and reached for his phone. She will cool off, he muttered calmly to himself. She always does. But somewhere deep inside the enormous silent mansion surrounding him, a terrifying possibility had already begun taking shape quietly in the dark. What if this time she never came back at all? The strange thing about peace is that at first it feels unfamiliar enough to make you uncomfortable. Clara spent her first week inside the small apartment waking up before sunrise because her body still expected the anxiety of waiting for Damien to come home. Every creak in the hallway made her glance toward the door automatically. Every late siren outside made her chest tighten for reasons she could not explain. Years beside power had trained her nervous system to stay alert even inside silence. But little by little, the quiet around her began feeling less lonely and more like freedom. Snow melted slowly along the sidewalks near the Chicago River while Clara walked alone each morning wrapped in a wool coat, with coffee warming her hands against the winter air. No security detail followed behind her anymore. No black SUVs waiting at every corner. She could stop wherever she wanted without anyone reporting her movements back to Damien's world. The simplicity of that realization felt almost unreal. One Thursday afternoon, freezing wind pushed softly against the windows of a small bookstore cafe tucked between old brick buildings near Wabash Avenue. Clara stepped inside mostly to escape the cold. Warm jazz drifted through the room beneath hanging amber lights while the scent of espresso and old paper wrapped gently through the air. Shelves lined with worn novels stretched toward the ceiling beside small wooden tables scattered near fogged windows overlooking the snowy street outside. The place felt calm in a way luxury hotels never did. Real. Clara removed her gloves slowly while standing near the entrance reading handwritten recommendations taped beneath several bookshelves. Careful with that section, a voice said nearby. People disappear in there for hours. Clara turned slightly. A man stood behind the counter arranging ceramic coffee cups onto a tray. Mid-30s. Dark green sweater rolled at the sleeves. Slightly messy brown hair. Calm eyes carrying the kind of quiet attention that did not feel intrusive. He smiled faintly toward the shelves beside her. Russian literature, he explained. Dangerous for winter afternoons. Clara found herself smiling back before she could stop herself. I will try to survive. Most people do not. His tone stayed light and easy. No intimidation. No performance. Just conversation without expectation attached to it. Clara glanced toward the menu hanging behind the counter. Can I get a coffee? Depends, he replied casually. Are you one of those people who orders complicated things with 6 adjectives? Clara blinked in surprise before laughing softly for the first time in what felt like weeks. Real laughter. Small but genuine. Black coffee is fine. Good, he said while reaching for a cup. You already seem emotionally exhausted enough. The sentence caught her off guard. Not because it sounded cruel. Because it sounded observant in a way Damien had not been for years. Clara studied him quietly while he prepared the coffee. You say that to everyone? Only the people pretending they are okay. He handed her the cup carefully across the counter. Ethan Vale. Clara accepted it slowly. Clara. Ethan nodded once before returning toward the shelves carrying a stack of books beneath one arm. No further questions. No curiosity about her expensive coat or the sadness hidden beneath her composure. Somehow that felt even stranger. Most people around Damien either feared her or admired the status attached to her name. Ethan simply treated her like another tired human being escaping winter for an hour. Clara sat near the windows afterward while snow drifted softly beyond the glass outside. Jazz continued playing quietly through the cafe while customers turned pages and spoke in low voices around her. Nobody here knew who Damien DeLuca was. Nobody cared. For the first time in years, Clara existed somewhere without being connected to his shadow. Across the city, meanwhile, Damien stood inside his office overlooking downtown Chicago while another untouched dinner cooled slowly near the edge of his desk. Papers covered the conference table. Security reports. Financial records. Endless business requiring his attention. Yet somehow none of it held his concentration anymore. His eyes kept drifting toward the empty chair near the windows where Clara used to sit during late nights waiting for him to finally finish working. One of his men entered carefully. Still nothing from Mrs. DeLuca. Damien stared silently toward the snow-covered skyline outside before answering. She just needs time. But even he no longer sounded certain. Because every day Clara remained gone, the silence inside the mansion grew heavier. And for the first time in years, Damien was beginning to realize something terrifying. Clara had stopped waiting for him. The moment someone stops chasing your attention, you finally hear the silence you created around them all along. February winds swept through downtown Chicago while snow melted slowly along the sidewalks outside Ethan's bookstore cafe. Clara had started spending most afternoons there now, sometimes reading near the windows with coffee growing cold beside her. Sometimes helping Ethan reorganize shelves while jazz drifted softly through the quiet warmth of the cafe. The strange thing was not that she enjoyed being there. It was how peaceful she felt existing somewhere nobody expected her to perform happiness. Ethan never pushed conversations deeper than she offered. Never asked why sadness still flickered behind her eyes some mornings. He simply treated her gently without trying to possess her pain. One snowy afternoon, Clara stood on a small ladder returning books to the upper shelves while Ethan adjusted the cafe lights near the front windows. "You missed a spot," he called casually. Clara glanced downward. "Where?" Ethan pointed toward the shelf beside her. "The Hemingway section. It looks emotionally unstable." Clara laughed softly beneath her breath. "I did not realize bookshelves required emotional balance." "Everything does," Ethan answered while straightening another lamp near the counter. "Especially people." The sentence lingered quietly in the warm cafe air between them. Clara lowered her eyes toward the books in her hands because somehow Ethan always managed to notice things Damien stopped seeing years ago. Not dramatically, just small emotional truths hidden inside ordinary moments. Outside the windows, snow drifted gently across passing traffic, while customers spoke quietly over coffee and old jazz records played near the back wall. For the first time in years, Clara no longer felt afraid of quiet. Across the city, meanwhile, the DeLuca mansion had started feeling unbearable after sunset. Damien noticed it most during dinner. The house staff still prepared meals automatically at 8 every evening out of habit, but now only one plate sat beneath the chandelier instead of two. Damien rarely touched the food anymore. He spent most nights standing near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan with whiskey untouched beside him while silence swallowed the mansion room by room. Clara's absence no longer felt temporary. It felt physical, like entire sections of the house stopped breathing after she left. One of his associates entered the office late Friday evening carrying paperwork beneath his arm. "The charity gala is confirmed for next weekend," he said carefully. Damien nodded distractedly while scanning security reports across his desk. "Good." The man hesitated slightly before adding, "Do you want us to contact Mrs. DeLuca about attending?" Damien finally looked up. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed his face before confidence returned automatically. "She will come." "You sure?" Damien leaned back slowly in his chair overlooking the city skyline beyond the glass windows. Clara knows appearances matter. But even as he said the words, something inside him felt unsettled. Because Clara had stopped answering his calls 3 days earlier. At first he assumed she needed distance after leaving the mansion. Then irritation replaced patience. Now something colder had started creeping quietly beneath his confidence. Fear. Later that night, Clara walked alone beside the Chicago River wrapped in a dark wool coat, while city lights reflected across the icy water beneath her. Ethan walked beside her carrying 2 coffees while snow drifted softly around them. Neither of them spoke much. Somehow silence felt easier around him. "You know," Ethan said eventually, "most people who come into the cafe are trying to escape something." Clara glanced toward him. "And what do they usually find?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Depends whether they are brave enough to stop returning to the thing hurting them." Clara looked ahead toward the glowing skyline across the river. The words settled heavily inside her chest because deep down, she still did not fully believe she was capable of staying gone forever. Years of loving Damien had trained her heart to mistake waiting for devotion. Ethan seemed to notice the shift in her expression because he added quietly, "You do not have to explain your past to deserve peace." Clara swallowed softly while cold wind moved through the city around them. Nobody had ever said something like that to her before. Not even Damien. Back inside the mansion that same evening, Damien stood alone beside the grand piano where Clara once played after midnight, while snow pressed softly against the windows overlooking the lake. His eyes drifted toward the empty bench beneath the chandelier light. Then slowly, almost without thinking, he sat down and pressed one uncertain piano key into the silence. The note echoed quietly through the massive room before disappearing completely. Damien stared at the piano afterward with a strange expression crossing his face. Because for the first time since Clara left, he was finally beginning to understand something devastating. The mansion never felt empty because she was physically gone. It felt empty because she had been the only thing inside it that ever made the place feel human at all. People do not notice power slipping away all at once. They notice it in small, terrifying moments when someone they once controlled no longer reacts to them at all. Snow covered downtown Chicago the night of Damien DeLuca's charity gala. Luxury cars lined the entrance of the Ashford Grand, while camera flashes illuminated falling snow beneath golden hotel lights. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while jazz musicians played softly beside towering floral arrangements and champagne towers. Politicians, investors, judges, men connected to both legal business and darker corners of Chicago society moved through the room in tailored tuxedos carrying conversations wrapped in careful smiles. Damien stood near the center staircase wearing a black tuxedo with one hand resting loosely inside his pocket while guests greeted him with practiced respect. From a distance, he looked exactly like the man Chicago always feared and admired. Calm, powerful, untouchable. Yet beneath the polished composure, something restless moved quietly inside him tonight. His eyes kept drifting toward the ballroom entrance every few minutes before returning toward another conversation he barely heard. She will come. The thought repeated automatically inside his mind because Clara always understood appearances. Clara always showed up eventually. But as the evening continued, uncertainty began settling heavier inside his chest. "You all right?" one of his associates asked quietly beside him. Damien nodded once without conviction. "Fine." Then suddenly, movement near the ballroom entrance shifted the energy of the room. Conversations softened slightly. Heads turned. Damien looked up instinctively toward the doors. Clara stood beneath the golden lights wearing a long black dress beneath a cream wool coat lightly dusted with snowflakes. Minimal jewelry. No diamonds. No bodyguards surrounding her. Her hair rested loosely over one shoulder while soft jazz drifted through the ballroom around her. But what unsettled Damien immediately was not how beautiful she looked. It was how calm she looked. Clara no longer carried the anxious tension he remembered from the mansion. No nervous glances toward him. No cautious emotional waiting. She entered the room like someone who no longer feared disappointing him. And somehow that terrified Damien more than anger ever could. Beside her walked Ethan wearing a dark charcoal coat over a black sweater instead of formal tuxedo attire. Relaxed. Ordinary. Completely unimpressed by the power filling the ballroom around him. Damien's jaw tightened slightly the moment he noticed him. One of the guests leaned toward another whispering quietly while Clara removed her coat near the entrance. Damien crossed the ballroom before he fully realized he was moving. "Clara." His voice remained controlled, but something sharp hid beneath it now. Clara turned slowly toward him. "Damien." No warmth. No bitterness. Just distance. Damien glanced briefly toward Ethan. "You brought company." Ethan offered a calm, polite nod without intimidation. Ethan Vale. Damien barely acknowledged him before returning his attention toward Clara. "You disappeared." Clara held his gaze evenly beneath the chandelier lights. "I left." The sentence landed quietly between them while soft jazz continued playing somewhere near the stage. Damien studied her expression carefully as though searching for the version of Clara who still needed his approval. But she stood before him completely differently tonight. Lighter somehow. "You could have answered my calls," he said more softly now. Clara looked toward the ballroom windows where snow drifted across the city skyline outside. I spent years answering your silence. Damien exhaled slowly through his nose while tension spread visibly through his posture for the first time all evening. Around them, powerful men continued conversations pretending not to watch. But everyone noticed. Chicago had never seen anyone speak to Damien DeLuca this way before. Not disrespectfully, simply without fear. Ethan quietly stepped aside toward the bar, giving them space without needing to prove anything. Damien lowered his voice. Do not do this here. Clara blinked slightly. Do what? Pretend none of this matters. For the first time that evening, sadness flickered briefly across Clara's face. That is the problem, Damien. Her voice remained calm enough to hurt more than shouting. It mattered to me for years. You just did not notice until I stopped waiting. The jazz music softened into a slower melody while golden light reflected across the ballroom around them. Damien stared at her speechless because suddenly he realized something devastating. Clara no longer entered rooms looking for him first, and standing there beneath the chandeliers while snow fell quietly beyond the glass windows of the Ashford Grand, the most powerful man in Chicago felt powerless for the very first time in his life. The cruelest kind of heartbreak is realizing someone finally found peace only after they stopped needing you to create it for them. The gala continued beneath golden chandeliers and soft jazz, while snow drifted beyond the towering ballroom windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Conversations resumed slowly around Damien and Clara after their quiet confrontation near the staircase, but the atmosphere inside the room had shifted permanently. People still greeted Damien with respect, still lowered their voices slightly when he walked past. But for the first time in years, none of that power seemed capable of reaching the woman standing only a few feet away from him. Clara moved through the ballroom calmly beside Ethan, while waiters carried champagne between crowded tables and photographers captured elegant smiles beneath crystal light. Damien watched her from across the room, with growing disbelief hidden carefully behind his controlled expression. She looked lighter somehow, not happier in a dramatic way, just free from the constant emotional tension he suddenly realized she carried for years beside him. Ethan leaned slightly closer while handing Clara a fresh glass of sparkling water near the balcony doors. You okay? He asked quietly. Clara nodded faintly. I think so. Ethan studied her for a second before glancing across the ballroom toward Damien, standing near several city officials. He looks like someone finally took away the one thing he thought would always belong to him. Clara lowered her eyes toward the glass in her hands. Damien never thought I would actually leave. Ethan's expression softened slightly. Did you? The question lingered between them while jazz music floated softly through the ballroom air. Clara stared toward the snowy skyline outside before answering honestly. No, that was the part nobody understood. She had spent years convincing herself she could survive emotional loneliness as long as Damien still loved her in his own complicated way. But eventually love without presence became exhausting, like trying to stay warm beside a fire that never stopped moving farther away. Across the ballroom, Damien excused himself from another conversation he barely heard and walked slowly toward the balcony where Clara stood. Ethan noticed immediately. I will give you a minute, he said calmly before stepping away without tension or intimidation. Damien watched him disappear toward the bar before finally facing Clara alone again beneath the soft glow of the ballroom lights. You seem comfortable around him, he observed quietly. Clara looked toward the city outside instead of answering immediately. He listens when I speak. The sentence landed harder than accusation ever could. Damien slipped one hand into his pocket while snow pressed softly against the balcony windows beside them. I listened. Clara finally turned toward him then. Her expression remained calm enough to make him uneasy. You heard me, she corrected softly. But you stopped seeing me a long time ago. Damien's jaw tightened slightly while the orchestra shifted into a slower jazz melody nearby. You think this man understands you better than I do after a few weeks? Clara shook her head immediately. This is not about Ethan. Then what is it about? For the first time that evening, emotion slipped visibly into Damien's voice. Not anger. Fear. Real fear hidden beneath years of authority and control. Clara stared at him quietly for several seconds before answering. I spent years feeling lonely beside the one person who was supposed to know me best. Damien looked away briefly toward the crowded ballroom. Politicians laughing beneath chandeliers. Men shaking hands over expensive whiskey. The entire world he spent his life building suddenly felt strangely meaningless standing beside her now. "I gave you everything," he said quietly. Clara's eyes softened with sadness. "I know." Again, no hatred, no cruelty. Somehow her gentleness destroyed him more completely than rage could have. "You gave me safety," she continued softly. "Luxury. Protection." Her voice lowered slightly. "But somewhere inside all of that, I became invisible." Damien swallowed hard enough for the movement to show visibly beneath the collar of his tuxedo. Because deep down, he finally understood she was telling the truth. Not dramatic truth. Worse, quiet truth built slowly over years of missed dinners, empty conversations, and emotional absence disguised as responsibility. Clara looked toward the ballroom, where Ethan stood speaking casually with another guest near the stage. There was no romance in the way she watched him. Only ease, peace, the absence of fear. Damien followed her gaze silently. Then suddenly, for the first time in his life, he realized something no amount of power could change. Clara was no longer standing beside him because she needed him, and standing there beneath the warm ballroom lights while snow covered Chicago outside. Damien understood the terrifying difference between being loved and simply being depended on. Some people spend their entire lives believing power can protect them from loss. Then one quiet night arrives and teaches them that love disappears long before money ever notices it is gone. Snow covered the streets of Chicago after the gala while black cars disappeared slowly beneath pale winter lights outside the Ashford Grand. Guests continued laughing beneath chandeliers and jazz music somewhere inside the ballroom. But Damien no longer heard any of it clearly. He stood alone near the balcony windows long after Clara left with Ethan, staring toward the snowy skyline while her final words echoed endlessly inside his mind. "You stopped seeing me a long time ago." For the first time in years, Damien did not feel powerful. He felt late. Hours later, the DeLuca mansion greeted him with the same cold silence waiting every night since Clara left. The gates opened automatically. Security nodded respectfully. Marble floors reflected warm golden light across endless hallways lined with expensive art and polished perfection. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet the mansion no longer felt like home. It felt like evidence. Damien removed his coat slowly near the entrance while snow melted along the shoulders of his tuxedo. Somewhere deeper inside the house, a grandfather clock echoed softly through the silence. No piano music. No warm light glowing beneath the library doorway. No Clara waiting beside the windows pretending not to watch for his headlights outside. Just emptiness stretched across room after room like something finally honest enough to stop hiding. Damien walked slowly into the living room overlooking Lake Michigan, where snow drifted endlessly beyond the tall glass windows. His eyes landed instinctively on the grand piano beneath the chandelier light. Clara's wedding ring still rested inside the small wooden tray beside it, where he placed it days earlier after carrying it in his pocket every night since she left. Damien crossed the room and sat quietly on the piano bench. The silence around him felt unbearable now that he finally understood what had created it. Not Clara leaving. Clara waiting for too long before she finally did. He lowered his hands uncertainly onto the piano keys again. One soft note echoed through the mansion. Then another. Clumsy. Imperfect. Clara once told him the piano sounded lonely when someone played without emotion attached to the music. Damien understood that now, because every note drifting through the empty house sounded like regret. Upstairs, half of Clara's closet remained untouched. A few dresses still hanging beneath soft lighting. Empty spaces where sweaters and winter coats used to be. The absence looked small until Damien realized those empty spaces hurt more than the expensive things left behind. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before noticing something folded carefully near the back shelf. Clara's old black scarf. The one she wore during their first winter together before the money became endless and the nights became longer. Damien picked it up slowly. The faint scent of her perfume still lingered in the fabric beneath traces of winter air. Suddenly memories arrived all at once. Clara laughing beside him in tiny restaurants before security details followed them everywhere. Clara playing piano barefoot after midnight while snow covered the city outside their first apartment. Clara falling asleep waiting for him on couches, pretending she was not disappointed every time he came home after sunrise. Damien closed his eyes tightly while gripping the scarf in his hands. The terrifying part was realizing Clara never asked for less love. She asked for more presence, more attention, more moments where she mattered before business did. And somehow he failed to notice how lonely she became standing beside him because he kept confusing protection with devotion. Downstairs, the mansion remained silent except for the distant hum of Chicago wind against the windows. Damien eventually returned to the piano and sat alone beneath the chandelier light while snow buried the shoreline outside. He stared at Clara's ring resting beside the keys for several long seconds before whispering quietly into the empty room. "I thought loving you was enough." But the silence gave him no comfort back. Because deep down, Damien finally understood the truth too late. Clara did love him. That was never the problem. The problem was that she spent years surviving emotional loneliness beside the one man who should have noticed it first. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Chicago while the mansion lights glowed warm against the frozen darkness. And somewhere beyond the city, Clara slept peacefully for the first time in years inside a small apartment where nobody made her wait to feel seen anymore. Damien remained alone at the piano until sunrise touched the windows pale gray above the lake. The most feared man in Chicago sat motionless inside a mansion filled with everything power could buy. Everything except the woman who once made the emptiness inside it feel human.